Now let's have a look at the improvements that were made to the graph editor. And for that I'm going to switch from the Maya Classic workspace to an animation workspace where the graph editor is in the lower section of the Maya window. Now when I select this animated ball here in the scene, you see or you don't see any curves showing up. It doesn't seem to be animated, that ball here. The secret is that the animation is distributed across a translation, a scaling, and a rotation node. So all of these nodes have their respective animation. And when I select all of them, I can see all of the animation curves at once in the graph editor because the auto load feature is on. That's this button over here. So when you change the selection, if you don't want it to reload the curves here, just toggle this one button off here. Okay, so what we see now in the graph editor are all the animation curves. I can pick curves directly from here or can select curves in the graph editor graph window. And then when I've selected them, I can see by this little button here, I can see this is the selected curve now. For most of the curves, I don't see much detail. So for example, this the rotation curve here, of course, has a large span of values, and that's why I see it. And the other ones here, like the scaling curves or so, they don't have a lot of changes in the values, and that's why we don't see any details. And to solve that problem, there is a different way of displaying the curves, which is the stacked view. The stacked view allows me to show all the curves stacked on top of each other, so that for all the curves I can at least see where the keyframes are, if they line up or don't line up, how many keyframes are there. So in the case of curves that lie on top of each other, you wouldn't see that one curve ends, for example. And apart from that, we don't see too much details because vertically there isn't enough space to show details. That is where another way of displaying the curves comes in, and that is the normalized view. So this button here shows normalized curves, which means that all of the curves are scaled up to match a minimum and maximum value here on the screen, even though the rotation curve, for example, goes from -100 to +100, and the scaling curves goes from 0 to 1 most of the time. So we scale all the curves up to show details for all of them. And that way you can show, how much a special curve speeds up, for example, and where there's a flat region and stuff like that. And you can still, when you select one of the curves, you can still see here by this little button which one is the selected one. Now let's have a closer look at these keyframes, or the display of the keyframes. You see that this keyframe here is a little hollow rectangle. And this hollow rectangle, and let me zoom in here so that we can see that a little bit better. So this little hollow rectangle also displays in the handles of the tangents. And this means that this is still the default position and the default values for the handles that was created by automatically making this a smooth curve. As soon as I pick one of these handles here and move it around, you see that the curve, the keyframe itself, and the handles become filled squares, just to show that this was modified from the default value that was initially created automatically. So when I undo that, you see that it changes the display immediately. Another thing happens when I break the tangents, for example. So here, breaking the tangents, this will display the handles, or this will display these lines here as a dotted line, just to show these were broken. And the same when I modified something, it becomes filled squares just to show this was modified. Let me undo that. And the last one will be when I right mouse button here, change it to non-weighted tangents. And now you see that the keyframe itself is a diamond shape and the handles become triangles, just to show, okay, this is a non-weighted tangent. I can't make the tangents longer or shorter. This is just, that's what you currently have. So let me undo that to go back to the weighted tangents. The weighted tangents are also default now, which means you no longer have to go into the curves menu and change these tangents because you've forgotten to set the preferences. These are the very obvious ones here. Remember that we can change between 3 different ways to display them. They also have hotkeys. So you can, in this window here, you can say 1 is the standard display for the curves, 2 is the stacked version, and 3 is the normalized version. Very fast way to switch between these displays. And the next example is going to be about the performance. There are now significant improvements to the performance of the graph editor. Look at this scenery. We have a bunch of characters. They all are animated with motion capture examples from our content browser. And I can pick all of these characters, which would just select their root nodes. But then I can go and select the complete hierarchy of all of these nodes, and you see we have a whole lot of curves now in the graph editor, which would normally impact the performance of the graph editor. But when I hold the Alt key and move the camera or my view around, you see that this is super fast now. I can zoom in and out, and everything is extremely fast and very performant. When I select a whole bunch of these keyframes here, which are thousands of keyframes now, the first thing you see is that all the handles are displayed by default. You can turn this off. So you can say the system by default, I don't want to see any tangents. Like never, right? So I can move my keyframes around like this with the middle mouse button, and you see it is relatively slow, but this doesn't have to do with the graphical performance. This has more to do with this one here. When I overlay these selected keyframes with the other keyframes, Maya is trying to make one consistent curve out of it and mixes all of these keyframes together, which of course takes a while to do. When I undo that and keep zooming in and out, you see this is the real performance. This is what makes this so much faster and allows you to work much faster on a larger number of keyframes in the graph editor.